Hi, I'm Ted Pattison of Critical Path Training. In this video screencast tutorial, I'm going to show you how to get up and going accessing SharePoint list data from the new LINQ to SharePoint provider that's built into SharePoint 2010. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, well, we'll start the demo by going to our test site at internet.wingtip.com. This is a freshly created blank site. There are no lists inside there. And if I go look at all site content, you can see that the only two document libraries are the two that automatically get built whenever you create a new site in SharePoint 2010. So let's create a list. I'm going to go to the Site Actions and pick More Options. And what we're going to do is we're going to pick the Custom List type, and we're going to create a new list named Developers. Once we create the Developers list, we're going to make a couple changes. Note that there is a single existing column because we created this list from the custom list type. So the title column, I'm going to take and we're going to rename this to last name. Now that we have the title column with the display name of last name, we'll add a second column for first name. And finally, we'll go ahead and add a third column. And this column is going to be named SharePoint Developer. We want to know if our developers actually care enough to start programming in SharePoint and be modern and progressive. And we're going to have the default value be no. We don't want false positives. People aren't born knowing how to develop in SharePoint. It's a skill you have to acquire. And now that we have that, let's go ahead and just add one or two developers to our list. So first of all, we'll add a developer. And this developer will be named Chris Sells. So now that we have this first developer in, we have to acknowledge that Chris has not really thought SharePoint is important enough, so he's not a SharePoint developer. And second, we'll go ahead and add in another developer, Joe Healy from the state of Florida. And once again, this developer just doesn't see SharePoint on the radar yet, doesn't think it's important, so we'll go ahead and save that. Okay, now let's turn our attention to the SharePoint tools and our project WingTiv Dev Project. Now, if you need help creating your first SharePoint project, you should see the screencast on getting started, which would basically bring you up to the point that we're going to start at right here. Now, in this demo, we're going to add a new user interface component by creating a new SPI based on the visual web part. We'll create a new visual web part and we'll name it Developers. Now, I'm going to go ahead and make a couple quick changes. I'm going to go to the elements.xml file and I'm going to change the group property value from custom to wingtip web parts. And we'll go ahead and save and close that file. And then also I'm going to bring up the .webpart file and I'm going to go to where the properties are defined and I'm going to add a Chrome type property with a setting of none, so our web part has no border and no title bar. Now, in my earlier screencast on adding SPIs, I went through how to build out the HTML for a visual web part. But if you don't want to watch a developer like me create another UI, which I'm guessing you don't, you'll be happy that I have some text here. Developers UI, I'm simply going to copy and paste some HTML and the layout of some ASP.NET controls inside here. And so now that we've done that, if I go back to our design view, that's what our UI is going to look like. Now, in order for us to program against the classes that are going to allow us to access the list, I have to create what's called a entity class source file. Now, I have a batch file that I'm going to use called generatewingtipentities.bat. If I open this up, you can see that there's a utility called spmetal. We're going to call to spmetal and we're going to pass it the URL to the site, and it's going to generate entity classes for me. And as it creates those classes, I'm going to tell it to put it inside of a namespace called wingtip intranet, and I'm going to tell it to, when it creates a source file, name that wingtipintranet.cs. So now that you've seen this batch file right here, let's go ahead and run the batch file. And as we run the batch file right here, it creates this class, this source file. I'm going to take the source file and I'm going to drag and drop it inside of my project. Didn't work the first time. Let's try it a second time. Now let's try it a third time. Must only work the third time. Now I can open this up and I can see the different classes that have been generated. Note that there's quite a few errors that are showing right here, and that's because I still need to add a reference to another assembly called Microsoft.SharePoint.LINQ. So let's go to the Add References dialog, and if I go and we sort the .NET components, and we then open this up, if we go down to look at Microsoft.SharePoint.LINQ, we'll go ahead and add that in. And what we'll see is adding the assembly makes the different errors go away. Now, there's really no reason you have to look at this code unless you're curious understanding how LINQ works. I'm going to go ahead and close this source file. If you want to see what's inside there, another way to do it is to look at a more logical view. If I look at my class view and I look at the wingtip intranet, notice that it creates a class called wingtip intranet data context, and I'll be using that class in just a second. And also, when I want to access developers, whether I want to read or whether I want to add a new developer to the list, it gives me this generated class called developers item. And look down here, there is a first name property and a SharePoint developer property, but no last name property. The reason for that is there really isn't a last name column, it's a title column. And developer item inherits from item, and item has the title inside there. Okay, so now that we've had a quick look at the code that's inside, let's go ahead and write the code that's going to make the developers show up in our ASP.NET Grid view. So I'm going to go ahead and open the source view right here, and I'm going to get rid of that event. We don't need that particular event handler for the page load. And I'm going to add a couple different namespaces. First one is system.link, that's not added automatically in the code behind for the user control. Second one is going to be Microsoft.SharePoint, so I can program against the SharePoint object model. And then finally, we're going to add the wingtip intranet namespace that holds our entity classes. Now, I'm going to create a field that's scoped at the class, which is my user control code behind class, and it's going to be based on the wingtip internet data context. And I'm going to create a new wingtip data context, and it wants a string parameter that has the URL to the site where the data lives. And instead of hard coding something inside here, we're going to say sp and sp context dot current dot web dot URL. And now I have a way to initialize my data context that doesn't have any hard-coded dependencies for any particular site. Now, every time this control runs, I want to populate that particular grid with a list of developers, so we're going to override the onPreRender method. And inside here, well, we're going to run a LINQ query. So using my LINQ programming skills, I'm going to say var query equals, and from, now I'm going to reference the developer item entity class, dev in dc.developers. And then to start real simple, we'll just have a select statement and we'll just project the developer as a developer's item back. Now, inside of the user control, we have this ASP.NET Grid. And the nice thing about the ASP.NET Grid and assigning LINQ queries to them is that I can say auto-generate columns and let it deal with the columns. So let's go ahead and move back to our code. And as I move back to the code, we're going to say grd main dot, and we're going to take the data source and assign that back to the query. And then the last thing I need to do is say grd main, and we'll have to call data bind to actually do that work. Okay, so pretty simple starting point right here. Let's go ahead and I'm going to do Control-Alt-O to bring up the output window. And then I'm going to right-click and choose Deploy. And that's going to build my project. It's going to generate the solution package. It's then going to install and deploy the solution package and activate the feature. So now I should just be able to add that particular web part. Now, let's go back to our site. And there's our two developers, Chris Sells and Joe Healy. What do these two fellows have in common? Well, they're both big, long-time advocates of MSDN. They both have a lot of horsepower upstairs as developers, yet both suspiciously have avoided SharePoint up to this point. And they don't have SharePoint development as something that they see as important on their radar. Okay, more on that later. Let's go back to our home page. And inside of the home page, we're going to add the new web part inside. So once the SharePoint worker process initializes, and I'm able to take the page and put it into edit mode, I'm going to go and say add web part. And under the wingtip web parts, there's our developer web part. Let's go ahead and add that to the page. And now that we've added it to the page, let's get out of editing mode. Let's go back to browse and just get a good look at what the web part is going to look like. And I can see that it's populating the grid, except it's got a couple problems. Well, it's giving me a path, which I don't really care to show to users. And also my title field is really something I want to call last name, and it's not even showing me whether this developer is a SharePoint developer or not. So the way that we're going to fix that is that inside of our code, we're going to go ahead and instead of just projecting back a developer's item, instead we're going to say new, and we're going to open up some curly braces right here, and we're going to create what's called an anonymous type. And the idea is you're just creating a class definition on the fly. And so the first column I want inside this anonymous type is going to be first name. And so that's going to equal dev.firstname. And then secondly, I want a last name column. So we'll say last name equals, and now I can do my column mapping by saying dev.title. And then we want to know if the programmer is a SharePoint developer, so we'll have an spdev. And that's going to equal dev.SharePoint developer. And if I want to make it a little bit more friendly with the grid, I'll just convert that into a string. Okay, and then while we're here, why don't we also take advantage of the fact that now, since I'm using LINQ, I can have LINQ do sorting. So if I say order by dev dot and title, I can sort by last name. And maybe I want to sort after last name in case two developers have the same last name. I can also say dev.firstname inside there. Okay, so now that we have that, once again, Control-Alt-O, and we'll bring up the output window. And now we'll right-click, and we'll choose Deploy. And as we go through, and we've done the deploy, it's now adding the solution. It's activating the feature. That's all great. I'm going to come back here and click on the home link just to refresh the page. And what we should now see is that I've run a LINQ query and I've projected the data into an anonymous type, and that anonymous type is being used to fill that particular grid. Okay, so now we've gotten this far. The next thing we want to do is we want to write some code behind this button so that we can add a first name, last name, and the SharePoint development characteristic, and have that developer added to the particular list. So let's go back to our project, and this time I'll open up the user control. One of the nice things about working with the user controls in SharePoint projects is that it gets to be fairly easy for us to generate the event handlers, and the way that we're going to do that is simply by double-clicking the button. Now, I want to create a new developer object, and the way that we do that is by creating a new instance of the developer's item. So that's going to be our new developer, and that's going to equal, and we'll just basically create a new developer, and then we're going to use the new syntax for creating items from a class. And what we can see here is that there's first name and there is title and SharePoint developer. So we'll say first name, and that is going to equal, and now on my user control I have a text box named txt first name dot text, and secondly we have to set the title, and that's what we're mapping to the last name, so there's a txt last name text box. And then finally there is the SharePoint developer Boolean column, and I'm going to set its value equal to, there is a checkbox control, and we'll basically set the checked property of true or false equal to SharePoint developer. Okay, now that we've created this new object, now we're going to go back to our data context. So we're going to say data context developers dot, and there is a insert on submit. And when I call this method, I need to pass in that new developers item instance that I've created. And then secondly, we'll say DC dot, and we'll say submit changes. So now with that in place, one more time, Control Alt O, and we'll come down and we'll run deploy. And now that we've done that, we want to go back and we're going to refresh the browser to basically load in the worker process and initialize it. And once the worker process initializes, I'm going to be able to test my work. Okay, so now we have some new developers. We have Wendy Wheeler. Wendy Wheeler is modern, progressive, sees what's coming down the pike. She's definitely a SharePoint developer. We'll add her in. And then also, who could forget our famous colleague, Don Funk. And Don Funk is also a SharePoint developer. We'll go ahead and add them in. So you see, it's pretty simple to add this stuff in. The one last thing we'll do is that we'll go back to our project, and inside of our user control, well, let's go ahead and change the list from all developers to modern developers. And we'll go back to our code inside here, and then there's one more thing we want to add in. We want to add in a where clause where developer dot SharePoint developer dot equals true. And now that we've done that, we're going to do one more deploy. And so what we see here is that when we want to use LINQ to SharePoint, the way that we write our queries changes incredibly from what we did in SharePoint 2007 having to use Camel. In fact, what's happening is as I write my LINQ queries, it's the one that behind the scenes is actually doing all the different things inside there. And so I go ahead and I refresh my page, and what we should see is as it runs that particular query, well, now those other developers are gone because I hit refresh and the last thing was a post back. It put Don Funk in there twice. But you can see that we've also solved the problem of eliminating the developers that